Hi, folks. I've just been having a huge rant earlier on. Just so upset by this poem that I saw, and it seems to be expressing a message that is so prevalent at the moment. It's just everywhere. Well, it's everywhere I'm looking, at least. What it is basically is just trying to argue that the current measures that we have in place of social distancing and lockdowns or shutdowns, whatever you call them, of people's movement being severely restricted, people basically arguing that that is a necessary thing for ecological sustainability. So I just watched a poem through a Facebook link, and it was basically, a very kind of well written, well performed poetry, but it was basically trying to say there were lots of positives during the social distancing, that there'll be less destruction ecologically, less pollution because there's less people going out, riding in their cars, perhaps people going out less to the shops and all that. So it was trying to say, have we found a really positive thing that could become a new normal? And it's not just that poem alone. My gosh, I've seen lots of films, articles, journals, lots of memes on Facebook. I'm just hearing this sort of message so often. It's becoming quite ubiquitous almost. It's so prevalent. And it just seems to be trying to argue that there's a real sustainable ecological reason for continuing these measures. Well, now, as I understand it, the reason for entering into these measures of social distancing, right, and the lockdowns, limiting people's ability to interact with others, the reason for doing that, allegedly, was to limit the spread of this infection. Now, that's disputed whether that's justifiable or not, and that's a discussion that many people are debating and engaging in. But there seem to be many other people that are now arguing for a continuation of the lockdown and social distancing measures, for them to continue, and saying that the ecological destruction of how we were living before needs to be changed. Well, there are lots of ways of addressing those issues, and certainly one, if you don't look at the ecological destruction and damage, that is a really big issue. And I wouldn't deny that in any sense. We've polluted the soil. There's large percentages of soils that are degraded and that we can't grow as many vegetables in. We've lost half of the world's rainforests. That was true some years ago. It's probably more than that now. Thousands of species that have either gone extinct or are endangered. We've polluted the airs, the waters, rivers, our own food systems. Plastic is being found inside fish. 1 billion people depend on fish as a staple of their food source. So we've polluted, land, sky with our chemicals, with our industry. So I'm not saying that pollution and ecological damage isn't widespread and isn't a serious issue. It absolutely is, and should be something of concern to us all, right? But the idea that restricting everyone's movements, locking people up and creating a prison planet with hundreds of millions of people locked up in their homes, or being restricted severely when they can go out, breaking up families and social groups and preventing people from having that physical companionship with one another, that's not a necessary measure to address those ecological issues. There are a wealth of many other good policies that could be done. We could be more cautious about the type of products that we buy, not buying things that are just going to be disposable and throwaway, invest less in a throwaway disposable culture, perhaps, recycle more, plant more, have stricter, firmer ecological regulation, don't dump chemicals, in rivers and polluting soils, we should review and perhaps restrict our use of certain chemicals. There are a whole variety of different measures, in where we shop, what we buy, and the type of laws and regulations that could be instituted. There are a whole wealth of different measures that could be used to help curb the ecological damage and to to help us reach that ecological sustainability. There are loads of methods of achieving that. Funding good public service transport. You could give away free bikes to schools, couldn't you? With training of how to cycle. You could invest in cycle networks rather than depend on charities to do it for you. So there are a whole variety of different measures that could be employed and to help ecological sustainability. Now, how useful and practical all those are, there's a whole debate that's really fascinating that we've got to get involved in. But, the idea that you've got to restrict people's movements so severely that you prevent them seeing their social groups, you lock down and close all fetes, fairs, festivals, churches, mosques, synagogues, temples, community centres, youth clubs, support groups, restaurants, cafes, pubs, and so on. The idea that you close down all of these things as a way to save the environment or protect it is quite frankly ridiculous and quite deceptive as well. It's just a way of trying to defend these measures, or to a way to sort of encourage them to continue longer, to validate a longevity of it. Absolutely not necessary. There's a lot of good ecological measures that would allow for sustainable ecological solutions for the long term. And those are the measures that we need to sort of look at, both from an individual perspective, but also from a sort of in terms of company policies, governmental policies as well, and other organisations too, and their policies and how they treat the environment and what their environmental policies and behaviours are. Those things need and warrant serious looking at. It is a critical issue. And I'm seeing just lots of arguing for trying to justify the measures of self-isolation, of social distancing, trying to justify those based on an ecological, or it's almost being portrayed as a renaissance almost, seeing pictures, for example, of dolphins returning to Venice, of wild animals sort of wandering through city streets almost, certainly in some of the pictures do have some validity, the cleaner airs in some of the big cities, that's a big issue, isn't it? One study revealed that I read that the average young baby smokes 2 cigarettes per day because of the smog that they're breathing in a large, big industrial city, because of the sheer amount of car exhausts, and that's proven to be carcinogenic, isn't it? We know that. Now, you wonder what effect that has on the lungs of a little toddler or baby. That is a serious issue, and especially for people with COPD, asthma, or the other health conditions. The quality of the air in smoggy, big industrial cities, certainly big. It's a big issue. That's why you find some people in big metropolises wear masks. They have done for years. I remember when I went to Bangkok a few years ago, I witnessed lots of people wearing masks just because they work or live on alongside a busy road. And so the sky, is just constantly full of clouds of smoke. You don't see the stars at night. And so a lot of people, if you're actively working around the area, you do wear masks. You do have to take protection. And so the quality of the air in those built up in urbanized cities, that's a big issue. But I think there are perhaps other solutions to that than simply restricting whether someone can go out of their home or meet up with other friends or family members. You might ban cars, for example. In Vietnam, interestingly, they subsidize motorcycles. So if you go to Vietnam, you'll find mostly motorbikes there rather than cars, because they thought the roads would be too congested and gridlocked in rush hour if they had too many cars. So, you could do a similar kind of policy, but with bicycles, couldn't you? Heavily invest in public infrastructure of transport, buses, trains, and so on. Or you sort of, you restrict people's car usage, perhaps, which isn't necessarily the same thing as restricting someone's freedom to go out and socialise, to see their friends, their family, and other social relations. So certainly there are serious ecological issues like the air quality in urbanized, heavy traffic cities. That's a big issue, but there are other measures that could address that as opposed to the social distancing measures. And so I'm kind of very concerned just about the plethora, the amount of different messages, kind of with that same message, really. Whether that's coming through films, whether it's people blogging, Facebooking it with their different memes, I think they're called, Twittering. Or documentaries that are arguing for that. I think Michael Moore had a recent one. I've yet to watch that actually, but certainly it's a prevalent message at the moment. And I've got a real issue with extremist pagans, to be quite honest with you. I've met many pagans over the years, and I met many that have got a wonderful belief. I lived and worked in an eco village myself. It was an eco farm, and I saw the dedication, the hard work a lot of people put into not just talking the talk, but actually living and working and doing it in a practical sense. People that were actively engaged in permaculture and organic and free range farming in sustainable solutions, on a very practical level. And I saw and was impressed with the hard work of many, and that sort of revering. I'm seeing how sacred the land and the air and the water is, and trying to treat it like that. And even if that means, working really laboriously and having a lesser harvest potentially, because the insects eat some of it because you don't use pesticides, for example. I saw, many cases and examples of great sustainable methods. And a lot of those people, to be honest, did self-identify as pagans. They didn't all. Some people had a variety of other religious or non-religious beliefs, a whole variety. But there was certain group within that, within the eco-farm setting, that would identify as pagan. So I don't say accusingly of all pagans, people that revere and respect the sacredness of earth, of air, of water, and of ourselves, of humans as well, and of animals. I see that as they've got a very special relationship to what I see as the creation. I don't believe in worshipping the creation myself, but I worship the Creator. But I certainly do admire and respect, when creation is looked after, and I think we have got a duty to care for it, and to be guardians of it rather than masters and controllers of it. If we don't care for nature, how is nature going to care for us and provide and sustain us? So I think there's a whole kind of fascinating area there, what our relationship is with nature, and how we can learn to improve that. I think that's a big issue for all of us, individually, but collectively as humanity. My issue really, I suppose, is with not paganism, therefore, not all paganism, and certainly not moderate beliefs. And in fact, value and respect tremendously those people that make great efforts and strive in their practices to be ecologically sustainable and create a model and a template that others could follow. I find that a wonderful source of inspiration, in fact. And I've witnessed, many great examples of that, through studying on the internet and through living and working on an ecological farm myself, But I do find that there is, as with all things, an extremist element that I am deeply concerned about. I believe there's good and bad in all things. In science, there is, there are scientists that have an ethical consideration, that are cautious about what their research is about and what their reasoning for doing things is, what their motivation is. They will, they don't want to invent something that could be used to harm others, for example, and they see the limitations of their scientific inquiry that it has. But there are others, there are other scientists that would create things that could potentially be used to harm others, and they don't have that ethical consideration, perhaps, or those that believe in science as a religion, something to worship, and they see humans as somehow having being masters and all knowing, and sort of they don't have that humility to see that we can make mistakes, and we can get it right sometimes. We can get it wrong, can't we? So there are good and bad in science, but there are in religions and politics and philosophies, in all things. There's good and bad business practices, aren't there, really? Um, so, I would expect that to be true of pagan beliefs as well. And then there is an extremist kind of paganism, one that puts human values below looking after other things on the planet, one that argues it's okay to trample human rights and to limit people's civil liberties, right? If I can sort of allow that to be the reason for protecting the planet, if I protect the planet for a few people at the cost to the many people, aren't we, surely that's deeply unjust and wrong. And what about human rights as well as earth rights and animal rights? Surely you've got to you so it's that kind of attitude, that ideology of putting the protection of the planet above the rights of the majority of the public, as I would call them, the public in general, no? The general public. Um, and I think human rights have to be important, and it shouldn't be a choice of, protecting the world and making it ecologically sustainable, or having human rights. It's looking for a world and an ideology where you can implement the best of both, where you can allow human rights that also respect ecological sustainability. In actual fact, one thing should be supporting the other, if you think about it, really. Having good policies that regulate strongly whether you have pollution or not, within the environment, that itself can prevent people from being poisoned or intoxicated with things that could damage their health. So that is a human right if you actually consider it as an issue. Protecting the environment is protecting people, actually. So they are compatible, and I think now protecting the environment is protecting people, right? But some human rights aren't always protecting the environment. It doesn't work that way around. The right to go out and have a giant party and throw stuff all over the place and trash the environment. We don't have a right to do that. We've got to balance human rights with human responsibilities, both to our fellow man, but also to the planet too, because it's going to be a consequence of how we treat the planet. It's going to be blowback at the end of the day, isn't there, of how our fellow man and ourselves get treated in that. If we pump out enough, toxic gases into the environment, and that's more than the Earth's atmosphere can deal with, we are going to create smoggy atmospheres that are going to affect the health of other people. If we... So we've got to find sort of ecologically and humane, sustainable ways, and there are lots of ways, thankfully, that are already happening. They're tiny. There are lots of small projects. You see them scattered all across the world, lots of different regions, and you're seeing lots of good working models that are ecologically sustainable. And you've only got to have a few of those to find out, yes, it is possible. It does work. So it therefore becomes a possible template, something that can be done and expanded on in a larger kind of way. Now, I'm not an expert in ecological development and that. I try and study a little bit of everything, really. But I certainly have met many people that are experts in these fields, and I know that there's a lot of contention over different issues and how sustainable and how realistic it is and practical for us actually to live with those in larger cities. So I think there is a fascinating area of debate, and it does warrant a lot closer inspection. But this whole narrative that I'm hearing from so many different sources, that these social distancing measures have a positive impact and are necessary and can be justified for ecological sustainability, I find that deeply flawed, and I'm very concerned actually that easily could be argued to limit people's civil liberties over a longer period of time. And actually, we don't need to do that. There are a lot of other good, sustainable, ecological methods, right? That solutions to all of those ecological problems. If there is the will, there are the ways. We don't need to lock up millions of people for many years and restrict their civil liberties. We don't need to do that as a measure, because there are lots of other good methods if we are willing to look into those, and consider them as workable, practical solutions. I don't claim that. I certainly don't have all the answers, and the people I've met don't. But they do certainly have potential solutions, and that certainly warrant closer inspection.